Well, here we are, week 4. Congratulations to making it through the first 3 weeks. You're a quarter of the way there. This week in the lecture, we're going to look at assessment in mathematics. And in looking at this, we know that you've already seen and engaged with ideas about assessment across some of your other general courses. So here we want to focus specifically on what it might look like in mathematics classes. So all those general principles and things you've learnt before still apply in maths, but here we'll look at specifically about some of the concepts. And again, some of these things we're covering is so we have a course that is designed to meet your requirements to be registered as a teacher in Queensland through the Queensland College of Teachers. Before we start, I should also acknowledge that a lot of this course material has been developed and structured to meet those requirements by Associate Professor Raymond Brown, who took the course previously, and I've taken over from him. And so I want to acknowledge a lot of the work that's been done here is his. So in this lecture, we want to look at assessing maths in students, and then we look at how that relates to learning disabilities and how you can use the resources that are available through the curriculum, the elaborations and the standards and things like that to help develop good assessment tasks that help you understand students' learning. Again, as usual, these slides will be available on the Learning at Griffith site, so you can access them after, because there's some things and tasks you might want to follow up from the links. And so although this mini lecture here won't go for an hour, if you do all the activities around it, it should take you a fair bit of time afterwards as well. So, some few things about assessment in mathematics. The assessment should firstly reflect the mathematics that all students need to know and be able to do. Now that might seem like common sense, but it's really important that the assessment you do is actually related to the maths they're learning and the things you want them to know, not something that's on the side. Sometimes we narrow it down to the things that we can easily assess, and we ignore some of the things that might be a little more difficult to see. The other thing is assessment should always enhance learning. The purpose of assessment mostly is to help students with their learning and to engage with the ideas and advance in their mathematical knowledge, skills and their attitudes, to help them be stronger and better and more confident mathematicians. Assessment should promote equity, and by that we mean that it needs to be available to everyone to show what they've learned. And that doesn't always mean that everyone has to do the same thing. So if, for example, you might have seen some of those cartoons where it had a picture of a fish and a gorilla and a bird and a lion, and it says, in this week we're going to assess your physical skills by who can climb a tree. So clearly some people are predisposed to being able to do well in certain sorts of assessments, and some are going to struggle. So you need to make sure everyone has opportunities to display what they know and understand. Assessment should always be an open process too. Students shouldn't get to an assessment task and be surprised that they're being assessed, what they're being assessed on or how they're being assessed. They should understand what they're being assessed on and what you're looking for. And it should be coherent, it should make sense, it should flow and connect to their learning. It's not sort of some extra bit stuck on the end. So here's some key ideas. Not all of them, but just some things to think about. The first thing with assessment is no one gets taller by being measured. So your job fundamentally is a teacher. You're there to teach the kids and help and facilitate their learning. And as part of that, you will do some assessment of them. Mostly informal and formative, occasionally summative and formal. But don't spend too much of your time measuring the kids. Spend most of your time teaching with the teaching and learning that's involved. Certainly I've been in places where kids are doing an assessment every week or every 2 weeks, and I think that's overkill. You'll collect more information than you can ever do anything with. The second point, don't let the assessment tail wag the curriculum dog. In other words, what sometimes can happen is we look at what we're going to assess and then we go back and teach them that. And the problem with that is you only end up teaching things that can be assessed. And there's lots of things that are important that students can learn that may not be easily measured or assessed. Certainly, an important point is that measurement is not a good analogy for assessment. Some things can't be measured. You can measure kids' performance in lots of things, but some things you can't, and they're important. So all aspects, like, do students engage with their work? Do the students enjoy it? Have they participated? Have they been able to communicate their ideas? These things aren't always easy to measure, but they're certainly a part of the things you should be assessing and evaluating as the students learn. So don't just restrict yourself to what can be measured. Think more broadly about assessment. And as teachers, your professional judgments are an important part of that. The third point is assess what's important. Or the other way around, what you assess will tell the students are important. Now, I know none of you are like this, but often students want to know what the assessment is, and then that's all they do in the course. So in this course, you've got 2 assessments. Of course, none of you would do this, but occasionally we get students who just want to do the assessments. They don't want to learn anything, they just want to do the assessments. And that's because the assessment tells you what we think is important. So if something's important, you should assess it. So for example, if in the class you think it's really important that the kids collaborate, then you need to assess it in some ways. It tells the kids that it's important, and you're going to report on it. So assessment is a really powerful way of telling students what's important. But you've also got to be careful. So in something like measurement, if you only go with formal tests, well, in a formal test in measurement, you can't really get them to do any measurement. You can only get them to calculate area or perimeter or something from a figure which represents someone who's already done the measurement. If you think it's important, they can estimate objects, they can measure things and things like that. You can't always do that in a test. So make sure you assess what's important, and that means you'll need to broaden your assessment, of course, to things much broader than just a test. I'm sure you already know that, but in math sometimes we can get caught narrowing things down to a test, and even things that can be done online, which makes it even narrower. The last thing is, when we assess students, they give us all sorts of information about what they've learned. But often what we do as teachers is then get all that information, we give ticks and crosses, and we add up the score and we write down a mark. Now in doing that, what we do is we throw away all the useful information the students have given us about their learning. They told you what parts of the previous unit or what you've been learning they've done well in. They've told you what they're struggling with. They've told you about their misconceptions, and they've told you the parts where they need more help. But if you just add them all up and put a score down, then you're throwing away all the useful information. So I'd rather a teacher did a lot less assessment, and when you do the assessment, do something with the information. So if, for example, a test had 4 questions, and it was an arithmetic test, one was about addition, one was about subtraction, one about multiplication, one about division, rather than just adding it up and giving them a score out of 4, it will probably tell you which parts of those 4 operations they're doing well in. And you might find that you've taught the parts on addition and subtraction really well. The multiplication they're going okay on, and the division stuff they've got no idea. Now what that tells you is, as a teacher, you need to go back and revisit the division because you probably didn't present it in a way that connected with the students the first time. So when you do assessment, you're going to get a lot of information from students that will tell you about their learning, but that also tells you about their teaching. So don't throw away all that useful information. Okay. Now at this point, we want to just talk quickly about learning disabilities and what they are and what they aren't. So learning disabilities are things where students have difficulty reading or writing or doing mathematics or numeracy type things. So ones you'll be familiar with: dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia. And there's a tube there where you can get some more information on those. But when students are being assessed, often these things will impact their capacity to show you what they've learned. It's not an intellectual disability. It's not that they haven't necessarily learned it or they want to learn it. It's just something that a personal disability that interferes with their capacity to express that or to engage with the material. So the good thing about these things is there's ways to help students with those, to get around it and to still achieve well and show their understanding and performance. And you should engage in those things. When you find a student, for example, has done something incorrectly in an assessment you might do, don't necessarily assume it's that they don't know how to do it. It might be related to a learning disability that they have. I encourage you to look at that video and it'll give you some useful ideas and information. And again, as always, think about what this means for you as a teacher. So some takeaway messages. These are very general, and all your learning needs of all your students will be different. But I would encourage you to use manipulatives even in the later years. If it's an idea that can be used, manipulatives, to help them start understanding it, then start with manipulatives. And students, as they are able, can move away from them. They don't need to use them all the time, but it gives some sort of concrete idea, a way of seeing and touching and feeling to understand conceptual development. So manipulatives are really important, not just for the early years. Look at different ways you can explore a concept. Now, sometimes you would have heard things like Gardner's intelligences or de Bono's thinking hats and all those range of things. And if you sum all those things up, what they say really is kids all learn in different ways and different things need to be approached in different ways. And to help them, what you need is to have a variety of approaches. So if you have a concept, can you introduce it through concrete materials? Can you introduce it through a diagram? Can you introduce it through an abstract method? Showing them lots of different ways rather than just one is really useful, and it helps different students connect. And indeed, as a teacher, what you wanted to help them to do is, if they start with the concrete materials, the manipulatives, you want to move them on through representations like diagrams and pictures, through to symbols, through to abstraction. That's part of your job as a teacher. And in doing that, what you do is not just show them one and then assume they move to the next one. You have to help them see the connections. So sometimes putting them side by side is a really useful way to do that. And you probably would have done some of this sort of thing, probably in Maths 1, where you looked at learning about number and number operations using bundling sticks and T-charts and the things like that. You need to suit your teaching to the needs of the curriculum, which is an obvious statement to do. You have to teach what's involved, but it doesn't mean you can teach everything the same way. The way you may teach measurement might be quite different to the way you would teach statistics or how you might teach number. So suit your teaching to the needs of the curriculum, but more importantly, suit the teaching to the needs of your students. Now again, when you start with your first teaching job and when you go in and practice, the students before you will be quite different. And depending on where you go, what sort of school it is, their background, their previous experiences, their maths teacher last year, their teacher this year, all those things will impact how they learn, and you need to adjust to the students and provide teaching that connects from where they are and takes them forward. And as much as possible, try and increase student participation. This will help kids with learning disabilities, but it helps all the kids in the class. The class exists for student learning, not for teacher teaching. So you need to adjust your teaching around the needs of the learners, because they are the whole reason the class is there. Their job is not to fit in around you. But of course there'll be some negotiation because you'll have your own style and ways you like doing things as well. But try to be flexible, try and use a variety of approaches. And this helps all your learners. Now, I'm just going to revisit this term learning difficulty because it's something you'll hear a lot, and sometimes students will have something that's been diagnosed through an assessment or an evaluation by a professional in the field, and sometimes something just kids chuck up because they're getting stuck. The truth is, to a greater or lesser degree, students will have some difficulty with something somewhere. So you've just got to try and make sure you provide variety and differentiated things for everybody. But the difficulty doesn't necessarily go across everything. A learning difficulty could be just experienced in one particular teaching encounter, or in one particular subject part of the curriculum, or in some time of their life. And it's always based on what's gone before. So what happened last year? What have you done already in this year in the class? There could be all those things that will impact upon it. And it can be really based on what they think and believe about mathematics, and their attitudes and the teachers they've had, and all these things that they bring to the learning situation. And you won't ever understand all that stuff, and you don't need to try and understand their whole background, but you need to understand that they're coming with something that's making it difficult for them to learn. And these things they've often learned at school. So without trying to do a whole evaluation of their previous history and what they've done and learned and how they come to something, just be open to working in different ways. And this is be part of your planning. Like when you're planning your teaching, you don't just have the same thing day in, day out, every day, every week of the year. But also a lot of it will come in the moment. You'll present something to the students, they'll start doing it, and all of a sudden you'll notice that some kids are having a learning difficulty at that time. So you need to change it. You need to be able to modify it. You might need to really radically change it to something different to help them access it. And to do that, you need to really know your stuff really well. Don't wander into the class teaching something you don't understand, because you won't be able to see ways of modifying and helping the student cope with that. So I'm sorry there's no recipe here. It'll depend on you and the students, but the key is you need to really know the conceptual ideas you're trying to develop well, so you can then modify it. So what about mathematics assessment for students with learning difficulties? Now there's obvious ways you can help, and I'm not just talking about obvious physical ones like a student who's vision impaired, where you just need to print it larger, or sometimes students need more time. But if you get back to the purpose of assessment, the purpose is to monitor student progress, and you would have learnt this in your other course, formative assessment, how they're getting on, and then how can I adjust for them ongoing. To make instructional decisions, how can I adjust my teaching for this student, for this group of students, or for the whole class? Because I might have done a fantastic plan about something, done it with the kids, and they just didn't get it. So I need to go back and I'll know through assessment that I need to do it a different way. And that assessment doesn't have to be a formal thing, of course. It could be just your observations as the students as they're working. Certainly you'll need to do some assessment to evaluate student achievement, which is called summative assessment, of course. And then finally, you can also do assessment particularly if you work in units, as most schools do. When you finish, you'll get the assessment. It'll tell you about the student learning, but it'll let you know about that whole unit that you've prepared and planned and worked through, because then you can modify it for next time, because you'll never have the perfect one. Now, again, there's a link there that you can follow up. This is an official one to the government site, you can see there, and I encourage you to go and look at it. It looks at the standard elaborations, and it talks about how you can use them to develop assessments. But just briefly, in the curriculum they give the standards, as you know, we've already talked about, and then they give elaborations, which gives you more information about it. And so these things are useful to help you guide your teaching and what the kids are learning. But it also gives you an idea of some of the things that the students need to demonstrate to show their learning. Not just what they've learned, but the depth of their learning and their understanding. So the standards are useful for those sorts of things, to give you like that benchmark or a measuring stick. It's also useful, you can give them regular feedback, and it helps you just, as much as possible, see where they should be at for their age group. Now you need to take all that with a grain of salt, because we know that kids don't develop in a nice linear fashion. We know that kids go up and down all the time. But certainly if I was teaching a class of year 5s, when they come in they could be working at the curriculum level from grade 3 right through to grade 7. But your goal would be, as far as possible, to get all of them at least working at the grade 5 level by the time you finish the year, and the ones who are advanced, that you're challenging them in different ways without necessarily always pushing them forward. So the standards are useful for that. They're in the curriculum. That document is there for you to really pore over and think about, again, relative to your own teaching practice. Now, when I was at school, which was a long time ago actually, you might find that hard to believe, all we did was tests. That was it. And there's obviously been some moves away from that. You would have done year 12 recently, most of you, and you would know that there was a requirement for problem solving and mathematical modelling tasks to do projects and things like that. So there is a move away from just using tests, although I'd say that sometimes now with the advent of these computer-based programs, in some ways we're moving back to test-like things which can be done online. Tests have their place, but they're not the be-all and end-all of the curriculum. We need things that are much more diverse and wider and broader to help understand students' learning in mathematics. So you might do the occasional test, but there'll be a lot more things to do than just that. What you want to do is make sure you try and assess students' conceptual understanding, not just do they know something, do they know the facts, can they repeat a procedure, do they have conceptual understanding? And that can be a bit tricky because sometimes you'll have to infer it from the things that they can produce in some sort of task or activity. And the other thing is now with assessment, we don't just want to know about their knowledge and skills, we also want to know about their attitudes. Can they communicate mathematical ideas? What's their thinking like? Can they use technology in a meaningful way? Can they reason about things? Can they work in a group? All these things which used to be seen as separate from mathematics are now part of the curriculum. And that means you don't assess them as something separate from learning the mathematical content and skills. It's actually an integral part of it. And you have to be able to report on it. This is more than just giving a kid an attitude grade on the report at the end of the year. So you'll come across kids with a range of learning disabilities, but one you might see commonly in the classroom is kids on the spectrum, the autism spectrum. And again, there's a video for you to watch. The reason I put the video there is it's a chance, which we can't do in a lecture, even a recorded one, is to show you someone actually working with the child. So have a look carefully. How did they work with them? What support was provided? How did the teacher interact with the child? Etc, etc. So once you finish watching this video, go and have a look at that one and then think about those questions there. Because it's highly likely that you're going to have students in your class who are integrated, who have disabilities of a range or variety who are in your class. You could have teacher support there or you may not. It's going to be a normal part of your work, as it should be. I've just put a little bit here about dyscalculia, and again, how might you assess a child who has this? There's some ideas about what that might look like, and again, there's a video for you to have a look at. But these kids often have trouble writing and recognising numbers. They might have trouble with basic number facts. They're all different. It's hard to say all of them are the same. They often mix up signs, particularly things like an addition with a multiplication sign, which looks similar, just turned around. They might rely on their fingers, which is just a form of a manipulative, or some of these sorts of things. The beauty is that they can learn how to cope with these things and how to get around them, how to still learn their mathematics and do well. These things are not just kids who don't like maths who found it hard to learn. This is actually a disability which you might recognise, they might have a formal evaluation of it from a professional, but in your class you'll have to find ways to help these students learn and help them understand them, and it's again just a normal part of your job. All right, this part here is just about designing mathematics assessment. I'm not going to dwell on it too long because I think it's probably very similar to things that you've already done on general assessment in your other courses earlier, and indeed while you've been on prac. And again, it's not really rocket science here. When you're designing assessment, the first thing you've got to do is try and identify what it is you're trying to assess. Be specific about it. The second thing is you need to develop a task that actually specifically addresses that thing or things that you're looking at, including things that you might include like enjoyment of maths, communication of maths, ability to work in a group. But the assessment task has to reflect the things you're trying to assess. The third thing is to actually develop the item and the sequence, and making sure in trying to cover everything you don't make this a huge task that's going to take them 4 weeks to do. Keep it simple. Of course then you have to give them the thing, and then when you get it you need to follow up with what's not clear, or what you don't understand, or what didn't come out. Sometimes you won't find out the shortcomings of your assessment until you've actually given it to students to try. One thing I would always do is every time I prepare an assessment for students, I would always try and do the task myself. And that might sound silly because this is a grade 3 task and I'm older than grade 3, but it just helps me see if there's any fundamental errors in it before I start. The tendency often is to make assessments too difficult. It doesn't hurt if the kids get it completely, but make sure it's accessible. You're not trying to humiliate them or make them feel like a failure. You want kids to experience success. If you've done a good job teaching and you do an assessment, then the kids should do well. So, again, I think this is probably something you're quite familiar with already. I've put this in here, and again, I won't read it to you, but it's there so you can download it and have a careful look at it later. This is the sequence of skills in terms of computation with fractions. So you can see the link to the document there, but there's lots of ways to try and get a sequence of skills for fractions or any other topic. And if nothing else, if you've got a school's got textbooks, I don't recommend that you use textbooks a lot, but they will have a sequence of, they will often sequence the learning in a reasonable way that will help you understand the sequence. This is there for you as a resource that you might use after. And then again, I'm just going through here a bit about fractions because this is something people often have common problems with. If I say nothing else about this, the first thing is you need to make sure you are familiar with, confident and able to do fractions and are happy to do it. You enjoy doing it, because if you teach fractions and you're anxious about it, the first thing you'll teach the kids is to be anxious. So there's just some common things again about what you would do in terms of developing kids adding fractions with unlike denominators, 1/4 plus 2/3. And last week we talked about some of the misconceptions they might have about that. For some of you that sequence will be obvious and well known, but for some of you it just might be a refresher to help you do that. Now, one of the things that's useful is to have some sample assessments, and the Queensland Curriculum Authority provides those things. The link is there again, and this is a resource that you should be very familiar with. And again, I've provided a link at the bottom where you can click on one which is about fractions. So, something else for you to do this week, click on that link and look at the fractions assessment, and then do the assessment yourself. See how you get on. You might find there's some parts you can't remember. It's not that you can't do it, you just haven't done it for quite a while. So it's a good reminder that you need to refresh it, refresh some of these ideas and skills and come up to speed. So there's just some general resources at the end, and please take the time this week to look at them and have a go. One of the things that we really hope during this course is you have a go at the mathematics, because when you become a teacher, you won't have time to reflect on these things. This is a chance to do it now. And it would be really important that you are confident, capable and enthusiastic about mathematics. And if you're not at the moment, then we've got a couple of years to sort it out before you graduate. Anyway, thanks for watching. There'll be a second part to this one where we'll look at Newman error analysis as a way of looking at things, if we didn't do that last week. All the best.